So, where we left it with Rousseau, after the discourse on the origin of inequality, was that it sounded like society is horrendous. What Rousseau says in that work is what the lesson that you would get from reading that work is that we were better off in the forests. Remember, in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he tells this speculative story of sort of the development of humankind from the earliest stage when we're just independent animals roaming the forests with just two passions, that is self-love, amour de soi, which is perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no negative connotation to that. And pity or compassion, that is feeling for others so that you genuinely feel their pain. And these drives are all there is to what you might call morality in this stage of humankind, this early stage of the state of nature. And the way Rousseau describes it is it's kind of idyllic. And then things get worse and worse and worse the more that we become socialized, until in the last stage, after the development of metallurgy and agriculture, humans are entirely interdependent and the rich are oppressing the weak, basically enforcing their illegitimate robbery of huge chunks of natural resources. They trick the poor into agreeing to legitimize property as a social institution and thereby enforce their own disenfranchisement. So it sounds pretty horrific. And that's Rousseau's diagnosis of contemporary society as far as he's concerned. Rampant inequality, which makes everyone worse off, not just the poor. It makes the rich badly off as well because of the bad form of love. There's amour de soi, love of self, is simply self-interest. And that's perfectly okay. That's just perfectly natural, and it just means that you look after yourself. But then there's this other kind of love that he calls amour propre, which is where you see yourself through the eyes of others and you become obsessed with respect, with being viewed with the respect that you think you deserve. And this is exacerbated by living in society so that it makes you it brings out all the worst in humans in society. They become jealous, envious, they become obsessed with dominating others so that they have to look up to them. They become obsessed with those below them. Rousseau would say that a common trick that the rich use on the poor in contemporary American society is to stop the poor from attacking the rich. The rich say to the poor, oh, look, you're poor because of those other people. So immigrants, those kind of things. They're scapegoats. So as he says in Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, people tend to look below them and be very obsessed with keeping those people below them. That's a sign of amour propre. And it's an almost unavoidable, it seems, in that discourse, result of living in society. So you have this natural early human who are free, happy, healthy, strong, much strong in comparison with modern humans in society, better off in practically every respect. So it seems like Rousseau has just trashed society and seems to be suggesting that we were better off when we lived in the trees. But even in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he makes it clear that he doesn't believe that this is necessarily so. There's a note, one of the footnotes, where he imagines his critics saying, what, are you saying we should leave society and go and live in the woods with the bears? Is that what you're saying? And as I said, Voltaire, in a letter to Rousseau, says, never have so much intelligence been used to portray us like beasts. When I read you, it brings a desire to go about on all fours. So Voltaire was very disgusted by this sort of praise, as he saw it, of savage man and trashing of civilized man. But Rousseau, another clue that Rousseau doesn't think it's necessarily thus in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is when he dedicates the discourse to Geneva, which is where he's originally from and where his father was one of the few citizens of Geneva. And he lists all the features that make Geneva so good. That's kind of a clue, and that sets up what he's doing in the social contract. And what he's doing in the social contract is saying, okay, we cannot avoid living in societies just because of the number of humans there are. So he's not saying like Aristotle. Aristotle just said, essentially, we have to live in societies because that's the way humans are. We are a political animal. We're naturally social. Rousseau clearly does not believe that's true, given the first stage of the state of nature in the discourse. However, he agrees that essentially now, given the number of humans on the earth, and back then it was tiny compared with now, it's unavoidable. Living in society is unavoidable. That being so, can we set up a society that avoids the ills described in stage 4 of the Discourse of the Origin of Inequality, the stage 4 of human development, interdependence? So, as he sets it up right at the beginning, this is Book 1, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1. The paragraphs aren't usually numbered, but you can count them. But you know, the books and numbers, books and chapters are. This is one of Rousseau's most famous quotes. Man is born free, so naturally free. So again, that's a rejection of political naturalism like Aristotle and Filmer that says we are naturally in a web of political obligations. We are not born free of political obligations. We're born already politically obligated. No, he agrees with Locke and Hobbes. We're born free, naturally free. And everywhere he is in chains, which sounds paradoxical. How can you be born free but be in chains? So what he means is we have this natural freedom that is the way we should be, but we're not that way. So that's the challenge. In response to that, he says what we've got to do, and he actually puts this in quotes himself, find a form of association, so humans in a group, which defends and protects with all common forces the persons and goods of each associate. Now, thus far, that sounds like Locke's view of the social contract. Remember, for Locke, the point of the social contract is to enforce property, is to protect the property of the individual, where property includes well-being and physical well-being of the citizens. And of course, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality seems to be a direct criticism of Locke, where Rousseau presents the social contract, where basically the rich say, come on, let's get together to protect our property. Clearly that's in their interest because they're the ones with the property and poor people don't have any property. And basically the rich are saying, protect our property from you guys so we get to keep it. So thus far, it's a bit odd to hear him sounding like he agrees with Locke. But the rest of it is the genuine innovation of Rousseau's version of the social contract, and by means of which each one, while uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself. Now, if that's possible, then it sounds like the freedom that the savage man had roaming in the woods is retained, because what is so good about the freedom that the savage person has. It's that they're under their own command. They get to do what they want to do. Nobody else gets to tell them what to do. So if that were possible, that would be almost perfect. You go into society, but you still obey only yourself and remain as free as before. Okay, that's the challenge. Now you might say, well, okay, give it up, because that's impossible. How can you acquire political obligations, acquire a government that makes laws, that tells you what to do, and yet remain as free as before? I mean, there's a reason anarchists and libertarians are opposed to governments, because they want to retain their freedom. They want to be in charge of themselves. They don't want the government telling them what to do. So this sounds like a pipe dream. And spoiler, it might well be a pipe dream. However, Rousseau does spell out what he thinks has to be the case to solve this problem. And the solution is his version of the social contract. This is in Book 1, Chapter 4. He says, each person gives himself whole and entire without reservation, and in giving to all, each gives himself to no one. All right, let's unpack that, because again, that sounds basically insane. And incidentally, both Hobbes and Locke have, in the 20th century in particular, undergone a sort of process by which the contracts they describe have been reinterpreted. The language that Hobbes and Locke use in both of their works makes the social contract sound like historical events. That is, that sometime in the prehistory of humankind, there were no such things as organized societies. Humans worked out that they'd be better off if there were, for various reasons. You know, in Hobbes, of course, everybody is driven by their self-interest to worry that other people are going to encroach on them, and this causes a state of war. Locke, the story is fairly similar, although not as bad, which means the difference in the kind of systems they justify. Hobbes justifies an absolutist, because we have to have the maximally stable system because the state of nature is so bad. Locke, the state of nature isn't that bad, in fact. So the only kind of government that would be better than it would be one that is fairly minimal, that protects their property and so on. With Locke, the powers of government, legislation, and executive in particular are combined with, that's Hobbes. With Locke, they must be separate. So there are key differences in the kind of political systems that they say are justified given the alternative, the state of nature. Now, both of them do sound historical, and which opens them to a criticism that all social contracts theorists back then were faced with, which is that just sounds like bullshit. It never happened. Societies didn't emerge that way. So they have to, in some sense, show why them talking in this way, that legitimacy requires, in some sense, a social contract. Less so for Hobbes, because of course Hobbes's theory essentially says that the point of the government is that it protects you from the terrible things in the state of nature. So Hobbes allows that a perfectly legitimate government can be one that was imposed on you by force. If, for example, another country that has a government invades your land and brings you under its control, you're still better off than you were before because you're out of the state of nature. Whereas for Locke, he's very insistent that you cannot even be part of a society without consent. You have to give your consent to be part of a society, and if you do not give your consent, you are not part of a society. And then you get into the discussion of tacit consent, whether or not you can be part of a society merely by living on land that they control, that kind of debate. But Locke is insistent that, you've got to give consent in order to be under political obligation. So both of them make it sound like there has to be an actual event. The social contract has, in some sense, got to be actual. Now, as I said, 20th century writers on both of them, often influenced by the guy we're going to get to eventually, the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century, John Rawls, have sort of reinterpreted both Hobbes and Locke's contracts as really not actual, or sometimes called hypothetical or ideal. That doesn't seem to fit with what a lot of them say. And Locke, in particular, gives much discussion of speculative history in response to the criticism that he raises himself, that, what do I say if people say this never really happened? Whereas Rousseau, it seems fairer to say that his social contract could be understood as not a historical event. So rather, and in fact, some commentators point out that there's a difference between the word contract and compact. And he uses the word compact when he's talking about this. So the social compact might be a sort of assumed agreement rather than an actual agreement. So you could be part of the social compact right now. Now, whether or not that's a fair interpretation, that it's certainly Rousseau's version of the social contract is very influential on Immanuel Kant, who is very influential on John Rawls. And Immanuel Kant, it's explicitly hypothetical. He is not saying that we have to have this moment where, in order to be part of society, you have to literally agree. It's like, remember, for Locke, each society is like a club, and the only way to become a member of a club is to explicitly agree. A club can't come to you and say, you've got to pay our membership fees because you're a member, if you haven't agreed to be a member, if you haven't chosen to become a member. That's the point of being free. There's a consent requirement before you can acquire obligations. That's Locke. For Rousseau, that's not clearly true. And in fact, it sounds a lot like just living in a particular area can make you part of a society. You can be part of a commonwealth, to use Hobbes's phrase, or a body politic is a phrase that Rousseau himself uses. You can be part of that simply by living there. Okay, so what is this? Each person gives himself whole and entire without reservation. In giving to all, each gives to no one. Well, a couple of things to note to, again, differentiate between Rousseau and Locke. According to Locke, there are laws of nature that govern anybody, even outside of political society. So even if there'd never been such a thing as a government, there would still be moral laws. And we have to obey the moral laws. And the moral laws are the laws of nature, which are different from Hobbes's laws of nature. Locke's laws of nature are very clearly moral laws that are morally binding, like you've got to keep a promise. Now, Hobbes does talk about keeping covenants, but it's more, you should keep covenants because otherwise you'll be punished by other people and they won't trust you. So it's in your own self-interest. Whereas for Locke, it's a moral duty. You just have to. Those are things you should do. That's one of them. And also, according to Locke, you can acquire property so that you literally have the right to it. It is yours. It belongs to you. It's not just stuff that you've managed to acquire whether or not it's yours. So there's possession, And then there's property. Possession is you just happen to have it. You don't necessarily have a right to it. Locke thinks, no, you can actually have a right to it, and you can legitimately own stuff even in the state of nature. That's chapter 5 of the second discourse, where he talks about property, an entire chapter on property. You acquire property by mixing your labor with it. So Locke thinks you can own stuff, you have all these rights in the state of nature, and any government must respect those rights. For Rousseau talks a lot about this on Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. There's no such thing as the law of nature. And his evidence is, look, all these philosophers talk about it, and none of them can agree about what it is. So how are simple savage humans to know what the law of nature is so that it can govern their behavior? It's just not going to happen. So effectively, there are no laws of nature. There's no moral law in nature, so there are no rights outside of government. So one of the things that you actually gain from becoming part of a society is morality. So one of the things that you make true is that you are a rights-bearing individual. If you are outside of society, there's no such thing as rights. Whereas if you're part of society, there can be rights. So any rights that you possess are as a result of you becoming a member of this body politic. So you've got to give up any claims to anything that you might have thought you had before being part of the society. So when you give yourself whole and entire without reservation, remember, Rousseau's main diagnosis of what's rotten about modern society is dependence. And that's the problem with inequality. Remember, the second discourse is the discourse on the origin of inequality. So inequality is bad, not necessarily in itself, but because it undermines freedom. Why? Because inequality leads to dependence. And it can be inequalities of skills, because that makes you jealous of somebody else. But as he says, we don't really have inequality of skills naturally in the state of nature. They only emerge, in particular, when we have division of labor and when we have people living in society and some people richer than others. So the rich people have leisure time in order to develop their talents and so on. So inequality only becomes rampant in civil society. And inequality leads to dependence, which is bad for both sides, the people who depend and the people who are depended on, because the people who are depended on become obsessed with being respected, and that in itself is amour propre, the bad element of amour propre. You need the approval of others. This is, social media has amplified this to a great extent. If you are obsessed with likes and so on, you are damaged. It sucks away from your mental well-being and from your very freedom because you are dependent on the approval of others. So, the bad thing about society is inequality and the dependence it brings about. If in founding society, like Locke argues you should, you come in already unequal because the rich have acquired great property, particularly in land, in the state of nature, then everything's going to be rotten. That's like building a house on rotten foundations. So to avoid this, the social compact must prevent that. So everybody has to give everything that they might think they own or have a right to up into the sort of the common pool, without reservation. Because everybody does this, in giving to all, so you give up your rights, not to anyone in particular, but to the common pool, as it were. So if you live on a plot of land, now the plot of land, you might have thought of it as yours, but of course it wasn't. You just happened to occupy it because there is no such thing as the right of property in the state of nature. But you give that up to possibly be removed from you. So now, of course, why would anybody do this? Well, imagine you're on a lifeboat. So, the Titanic has gone down, you've gone onto a lifeboat. What do you do now? You don't know how long you're going to be on there. The right way to do it is for everybody to empty their pockets and give out everything into the common pool, and then we share it out equally. If you don't do that, then what's going to happen? People are going to distrust one another. It's going to lead to fights. People are going to be stabbed and thrown overboard. The person who's been hoarding the Tic Tacs is going to be killed and eaten. It's all going to go horribly wrong. But if you do it right, if you pool all your resources, it's going to work. And I'll explain this in terms of the three kinds of liberty in a second. But all of these things are related for Rousseau, and it's kind of hard to explain one without presuming the other. But before we get into why this is so important and why this solves this problem, we need to talk a little bit about the general will. And the general will is one of the key ideas of Rousseau's. It is a term that has been used in previous social contract theories. I think Hobbes uses it, and Locke might use it too. But essentially, the general will is the will that is like the decision procedure of the body politic, the commonwealth, the moral entity that is composed of all the individuals. The thing that the famous picture in the front of Hobbes's Leviathan is of, a human being composed of lots of tiny human beings. That thing is the body politic. It's everybody acting as a whole. So the general will, in perhaps the most important understanding of it in Rousseau, is the decision procedure of that, which of course is going to be majority. It's going to be majority rule, as Locke says. Once you form a society, its will is that of a majority, just by definition. Otherwise, it would never make any decisions. So, the general will is the will of this body. And there are several things that are true of it, that are scattered throughout the social contract. It always tends to the common good. Now, the common good also in pink, because that's a key concept that we're going to talk about in a second. But because actually Rousseau means it in a way slightly different from the way you might understand it. And he doesn't make this clear that that's what he means, but if you analyze what he says, that's the only interpretation that makes sense. So, because I've said that, I might as well introduce it. There's two ways to understand the common good. The common good, in one sense, is the good of the majority. So there is one sense in which the common good could be to have a slave society. Imagine if a slave society, the majority lived so much better than in a non-slave society that it's for the common good to have a few people kept as slaves, because you're better off in that society. Most people are better off. So the common good in that sense can involve great individual sacrifice of some people. That is what people object to in totalitarianism and, communism understood as the right wing uses it. That's not what Rousseau means. Rousseau means by the common good, the good, not the aggregative good, but the distributive good. That is the good that everybody has in common. A good that is to the good of everybody, like clean air, clean water. That's a common good. It's a good for everybody individually, not a good for the society as a whole. So the general will always tends to the common good. It is always right. So Rousseau talks about the general will in semi-mythical terms and saying things like that it's always right and that it's indestructible, which makes it sound well, it's a little too benign a view, because here's the lurking worry about the general will. And this is no more revealed than in the other most famous, if this is the most famous quote from the social contract, this is one of the most notorious claims of the social contract, which is that you may be forced to be free. Now, obviously, that sounds like a contradiction in terms. How can you be forced to be free? That sounds like, you know, when a parent beats their child and says, "This hurts you. This hurts me more than it hurts you." That's bullshit, right? That's just a self-justifying bullshit. And this sounds very sinister. This sounds like something, you know, from 1984. It sounds like all totalitarian governments say, we're doing this for your own good. And that's exactly the flavor of this. And this comes up shortly after the introduction, after the introduction of the social contract. That is, who is forced to be free? It's people who disagree with what the general will says. So the key job of the general will is to make laws. Now, not all laws. It's to make essentially constitutional laws. Slightly more broad than that, but one of the key things about the laws that the general will makes is they must be general in their application. They have to be absolutely sort of high level of abstraction, which of course is what the Constitution does. The Constitution sets the framework within which more specific laws can be made, but it sort of governs it. So the general will produces laws specifically of that nature. But they can be, you know, the thing about the US Constitution is it's ridiculously short, certainly in comparison with the constitutions of other countries. Like, I believe it's like 25 pages, the US Constitution, and the Indian Constitution is like 250. So the Constitution can contain a lot more than the US Constitution does, a lot more guidelines. Okay, so the general will makes laws, and it acts as the sovereign. So in partaking of the social contract, you construct a body politic, like a commonwealth, a group of humans acting together in consort, that is the sovereign. So the sovereign is everybody. You're part of the sovereign. However, the sovereign makes laws that affects the humans. So this is the sense in which, in giving yourself to all, you become part of the body politic. And what does the body politic do? It exerts the general will, which makes laws. On whom do the laws, or to whom do the laws apply? To the very people making them. So the idea is that you retain, in a sense, your freedom because you are now, you are still legislating for yourself. It's just that for yourself as part of this body politic. You are part of the general will, making laws that apply to you. But the key thing is, because everybody gives themselves up equally, nobody has an incentive to favor anything specific about themselves. This is the notion of equal unto the law taken to its extreme. Because you don't have anything. The problem with Locke's social contract is the rich were already rich, and they set up a system to favor them, to keep them rich. The point of the social contract is to rule that out, which is why it fixes the problem that Rousseau identifies in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, or at least that's the idea. Because everybody gives up everything so that in making laws, they cannot favor the way they are. And we'll see this idea is taken by Rawls with his idea of the original position. And he gives a very nice thought experiment that sort of carries out the spirit of what Rousseau's trying to do here. Okay, but then you might worry, okay, so wait a minute, I give myself up, and in a sense, I can't object to the laws because I'm making the laws. Now, Hobbes says something very similar, and it's obvious bullshit when Hobbes says it, because he says that you have given your power to the sovereign, so it's not everybody acting all together. You've given the power, everybody acting all together acts to give up their power to the sovereign, and the sovereign is not the people. It's an individual, a monarch, or a group, or a body. The sovereign can be an individual or can be a body, but it's a smaller group than the people as a whole. Rousseau says, no, that can't happen. He says at one point, I can't remember exactly where, the English people thinks that they are free because the English people already has a parliament at this point. And he says they are mistaken except when they're electing their representatives, because then they're acting as a body, then they're acting freely. But once they elect representatives, they have given their freedom away to a subset of the population. Once you do that, you've destroyed the point of it. You have alienating your power, giving your power away to another, is destructive of freedom. You have put them in charge of you, and that's bad for them as well because of they are dependent on you. You are dependent on them. The bad dependence, the amour propre, all that bad stuff from Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. You've got that. What you must never do then is alienate. The only good kind of alienation is alienation where everybody does it equally, not to any subgroup or group of individuals, but to the entire group. So you give yourself up to the whole. Again, that sounds very sinister. That sounds like totalitarian. This is the kind of thing that gets people screaming communism. How can you give up, yourself to the whole? Well, you don't have anything outside of political system. There is no such thing outside of political system of natural rights or anything like that. That's the one thing that you have to agree on with Rousseau before you're on board with this. And then the only way you're going to get rights is if you set up a society. But you don't want it to be the case that society or that a subgroup of society decides what rights you have. It should be you deciding what rights you have. Well, it will be if you are part of the sovereign and you are the general will. Now, but then it sounds like, okay, will's towards the common good, then that's what if the majority decides we want to invade somewhere else, or like the Soviet Union absorbing other countries, or it's in the good of the fatherland if you are conscripted to the army and you go off and fight in our wars and you are just cannon fodder. That sounds very sinister, which is why, and particularly if you say, hey, I disagree with this business of me being conscripted into the army, I'm opting out of that, and he says no. You are forced to be free. What that means is you are compelled to follow the laws, whether or not you agree with them. And in so doing, your freedom is realized, because actually in going against the general will, you are unfree. Okay, that sounds very suspicious. But it's less nasty sounding if you understand the common good as what is good for all, individually, not all, what is good for everybody individually, not good for society as a whole. So then, if you disagree with the general populace, it's likely that your reason for disagreeing is just you being selfish and you not getting fully on board with this unity, with this giving up. It's as if you're on the lifeboat and you want to keep your Tic Tacs. And you say, I'm not on board with pooling everything for the whole. And once you do that, you destroy the whole point. You destroy the equality. You allow for dependence to seep in, for inequality, which undermines freedom. And so you are destroying the system that enables you to have rights. So the sense in which you're forced to be free is you are prevented from destroying the source of all good things. So this is like, imagine you want to be part of society because of the infrastructure that society has provided. You want to use the roads, but you don't want to pay taxes. Well, you're forced to pay taxes. You are forced to be free because if one person stops paying taxes, then everybody's going to stop paying taxes. The whole system's going to collapse, and we're not going to have roads, and it's going to be shitty. So in order for us to have this good thing that you recognize as a good thing, you have to do certain things. You have to give up certain things. And in being forced to do that, you are forced to be free in the sense of realizing the thing that gives you freedom. Which brings us to the types of freedom. Okay, so in the state, the reason why in the discourse on the origin of inequality, it looked like society bad, state of nature good, is because life for the independent savages in stage 1 was all fun and games. You know, they get to wander around freely, nobody told them what to do. That was natural freedom in the sense of independence. Now, Locke doesn't mean that by freedom in the state of nature, because he actually means something much more like what we're going to call moral freedom, because Locke draws a distinction between license, which is just doing whatever you want, and liberty, which is following the law of nature. And true liberty requires that there be laws. Whereas, of course, Rousseau is insistent that there are certainly no generally recognized laws of nature. So all that liberty can be in the state of nature is independence, doing what you want, not being told what to do by other people. Nature cannot affect your independence. You know, suppose you run out of food and starve. Well, that's actually not affecting your freedom, even though in some sense you're not free to eat, because the only way your independence can be compromised is by other people. And it's pretty hard to do that in the first stage of the state of nature, because you've got nothing that they can manipulate you by. You don't have family, you don't have property, they can't control you. It's very hard to control you other than physically holding on to you. So independence is sort of maximized there. You are going to lose that, he admits. In becoming part of the social contract, you're going to lose that. But, he says, you're going to gain much more than you lose. And again, there are two things that you gain. Civil liberty is the closest equivalent to natural liberty. And here an analogy I think is a good one is driving laws. Okay, so imagine you're in the state of nature. You get to drive wherever you want. You've got a car in this version of the state of nature. There are no rules. Now, this is kind of dangerous, because if there are no rules and there are enough other people, we're going to crash, because there's no rules saying you should drive on the right or you should drive on the left, or you need to stop and look both ways. There are no traffic laws. You get to do whatever you want, but it becomes dangerous when there are enough people. So you give up your right to do, well, it's your right. You give up the ability to do whatever you want, and what you gain in response is the maximal system whereby everybody can do as much of what they want without preventing others from doing so. So the traffic laws are, in some sense, some of your independence is taken away. You can't drive on the left, which is obviously the best way to drive. You're not allowed to drive on the left because we're in the US and there's a law, and there are all these signs, you've got to stop here and wait and so on. But as a result of following those restrictions, some compromising of your independence, everybody gets to drive in a fairly unobstructed way, and they get to go where they want, and they get all these roads that are actually more useful than if everybody just does their own thing, in which case we'd get traffic jams and the whole system wouldn't work. So civil liberty is sort of, you are independent of others by being excessively dependent on the city. You are dependent on the city in the sense of the city tells you what to do. But in telling you what to do, it does so to enable you to be as free as possible. So it enables, it's a way to get everybody to be as independent as possible, consistent with everybody equally being as independent as possible. Whereas the natural liberty clearly works to the favor of people who are bigger or stronger or you know, get to manipulate others. Whereas this enables everybody to have as much freedom as possible in the sense of independence. So that's one thing you gain from becoming part of society. But what Rousseau thinks is the more important gain is that you become, and this actually should remind us a little bit of one of the things that Aristotle says. Aristotle says that one of the reasons we are political animals is because one of the aspects of human good is to be part of the political process. That is, it is good for humans, it is ennobling in some way, for humans to be part of a process whereby they make laws for themselves, or they partake of this common system. That's sort of the idea that Rousseau has here. That, and actually, this is connected with amour propre. In the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, the negative aspect of amour propre is stressed. This is where you become jealous of others. You need, amour propre, remember, is where you acquire a view of yourself through others' eyes, and it upsets you. And this seeing yourself through others' eyes tends to lead to negative things, because when there is a disconnect between the respect you think you're due, well, the fact that you want respect is one negative thing. It means that you need the other people to give you respect, so they have some kind of control over you because they can deny you that respect, and it cuts you to your core. So you can be slighted, and of course this led to feuds and duels, which were a huge thing in Rousseau's time. So amour propre sounded entirely negative in Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. But in fact, it is a feature of humans in a social setting that is natural to them and can have, in the right setting, a positive aspect. And this is the aspect that if we follow the social compact and we give ourselves to all, you can get the respect that you want. So a way to put this, one of the benefits that people stress about a welfare state or a political system where the needs of the handicapped are met is that in some sense that society values those people. If we have a society where we say, of course there need to be handicap ramps everywhere, of course there need to be beeping on the street crossing so that a deaf person can know when it's time to cross. And this should be taken as read. And everybody should get angry if a building does not have handicap ramps. What do we say about that society? It values everybody. Everybody is respected. Everybody is regarded as equally valuable. And in being regarded as equally valuable, if you know that you're regarded as equally valuable, you feel good about yourself. In being respected by others, it increases your own sense of self-worth. So this is the positive aspect of amour propre. And it's part of what, an aspect of moral freedom. In being part of the society and making decisions for everybody for the common good, you are doing something that is ennobling. You are a moral being that is respecting others and being respected. And the freedom in doing that, you are enabling everybody to be genuinely free. Free from being told what to do by something outside of yourself, like a small elite telling you what to do. No, you're in charge. You, the people, are in charge. So you have obedience to the law you have prescribed for yourself. You are, in the literal meaning of the word, autonomous. Auto, self, nomos, to do with law. You are self-legislating. And that is a feature that you also gain from the social contract that you cannot have in the first state of the state of nature, where you're not part of any social group. So anybody who's been part of a group where everybody feels good about being a member of the group and a sense of affection, as it were, for other members of the group, will know that there's something fantastic about that. This is why people go to football matches, aka soccer matches, and sing along and take part in caring about what happens to the team, because there's something self-affirming about it. Now, it doesn't, of course, include the aspect of making laws, which is key to this, but that's the idea. So the idea is, in working as a body, you are freeing yourself from dependence, even dependence on your own human fallibility, because you can be stupid and you can make the wrong decision, thinking you're making the right decision, and you can be corrected. And this is when you are forced to be free. So a little bit more about the general will. So the general will is the will of the body as a whole. Another sense of the general will is it is the aspect of you that is concerned about what is good for all. So there's the general will, which is the will of everybody acting in concert. But within each of us, there is a general will, which is the part of us concerned about the common good. Now, which of them is always right? The genuine will of the sovereign as a whole. You can think, oh, this would be good for society if we did this. So you would say, my general will wills to, I don't know, more oil wells or something. That will be good for society because it will enrich everybody. But then if the body as a whole decides against oil wells because they think it'll destroy the planet, or it'll pollute, it'll be bad for everybody, you genuinely believe that they were for the will of all, but what you discover is you were wrong. So you shouldn't think, screw them, they got it wrong. You should think, okay, I learned my lesson. Now, the trouble is, each one of us, besides having a part of our decision procedure that is directed towards the common good, our own individual general wills, we have private wills, which are for our own good, and corporate wills, which are good for lesser groups than the whole body, like, I don't know, Italian Americans, or fans of the Portland Trailblazers, or Republicans, or whatever. So you have a view of what's good for that subgroup. You have a good view of what's good for you. And ideally, when you're being part of the sovereign and making laws, it will be the general will within you that is driving you. But as Rousseau admits, we're flawed And much more vivid to us is our private wills and then corporate wills, and the lowest one is the general will. This is why the will of all is everybody in society following their own general will. Because we're flawed, or at least intending to, because we're flawed, this can be mistaken. And in fact, the more we are atomized, the more we are selfish, the more that we are concerned about us as individuals, the worse the will and all will be, and the further it will drift from the ideal general will. And in fact, what's practically impossible is to start a new society where everybody is concerned for the general will. Because the way to ensure that the general will is closest to what the ideal general will be, and genuinely will the common good, what is good for all, is if there's a real sense of esprit de corps. That is, everybody is really on board with this project. So, for example, the more that the body politic is like a family, because the family, there are these natural bonds of affection, and you genuinely would sacrifice yourself for your family. If society could be more like that, then we're much more likely to have the general will achieve the common good. But it's very hard to do that with people you've never met. So, in a book 2, chapter 7, Rousseau says, really we need this semi-mythical lawgiver to set things up to begin with. So basically we need somebody to start us off, to bootstrap this process and produce a constitution that will get things off and running. Now, he points to a famous example, which is a figure called Lycurgus, who wrote the constitution of Sparta, which even the Athenians regarded as an amazing constitution. Aristotle, another fan of Lycurgus. So Lycurgus actually did exist, but the legislator is talked of in almost mystical terms in this chapter. And he's only ever mentioned in this chapter. So this chapter, it's a bit of a concession. Some people look at this chapter and say, wait a minute, is Rousseau saying that without this godlike figure, none of this will ever work? Well, then some people, a famous Harvard political scientist called Judith Sklar, interpreted Rousseau this way as effectively saying, so it's impossible. So back to the lesson of the discourse on the origin of inequality, that life in communities is screwed and impossible to get right. Is he effectively saying that with his discussion of the legislator? Now, most commentators don't think so, but they do think, well, it's a bit of a bad sign that he thinks that we have to do that. But there are other parts of the social contract where he seems to be saying maybe other things could do the job as well. So, for example, if there is enough of a public culture where everybody is patriotic and really loves their country, as he loved Geneva, as is clear from, even though Geneva stabbed him in the back and actually exiled him and burned all copies of the social contract, so that didn't work out too well for him. But as a patriotic Genevan, if everybody really, really loves their country in the right way, then this will create the circumstances where you're much more likely to really participate in this common process and do everything right. All of what I've been talking about is basically in mostly book 1, some of book 2. Books 3 and 4, a bit more boring. Government is the topic of book 3, and the government is, well, it sounds like, if from everything that I've said so far, that Rousseau is a fan of direct democracy. That is, where everybody acts to make the laws as one. Like, we don't have direct democracy, and it's not just because of the, that stupid system where, you get 2 senators from each state, even if the state is Wyoming or California. We don't have direct democracy. At best, we have representative democracy, which Rousseau was very critical of when he was talking about the British. He says the British think they're free, they're wrong except once on election day. But the rest of the time, they're not. So it sounds like he's in favor of direct democracy where everybody is voting all the time and more like referendums, That's direct democracy. Referenda. But actually, he's not. Rousseau says that the best system is elective aristocracy, which is a little bit confusing. Why does he say this? Well, because the government is a body whose job it is to interpret the will of the sovereign and put it into effect. Why do you need such a thing, a smaller group of people separate from the people as a whole? To make specific laws. Because if you have to make specific laws, inevitably they'll talk about particular individuals or particular groups, which takes away from the generality and means that we now have, if it were up to the body of people as a whole to make these more specific laws, then they would not be thinking generally, and they would let their private or corporate wills infect this process, and we would lose all of the benefits of pure generality. But because you have to have laws that apply to specific groups or specific individuals, these laws must be made, but they have to be made by the government, which is a servant of the sovereign. So it's still the case that the people are in charge because they have the ultimate legislative power, but it's just too inconvenient for them to be perpetually making laws because they couldn't live their lives. So we have to have a body in charge of making specific laws, and that's the government. And he has this discussion, as I said, of various versions of the government, and it mirrors the discussion we've seen from everybody up to this point. If it's a lot of people, it's a democracy. If it's a small number of people, it's an aristocracy. And if it's one person, it's a monarchy. And he ends up saying, he says basically, depending on your system, depending on your situation, one might be better than the other. So for example, if you live in a desert, maybe a monarchy would be better. If you live in a resource-rich environment, then maybe a different system. But he says, on the whole, speaking generally, elective aristocracy is probably the best system. So that's the discussion of government. And then he talks about voting. And if the will of all is not the general will, then how do we recognize what the general will is? If the will of all is just everybody voting as one, but the general will isn't necessarily that. Because why? Because the general will, by its definition, tends to the common good. And it's possible for the will of all, people think they're voting for the general will, but they're mistaken as to what is genuinely in everybody's interest, and they're influenced without knowing it by their private or corporate wills. So the will of all might make the wrong choice. And again, to avoid that, you have to have an enlightened population, or you have to have this legislator who can genuinely see what is in the common good and bring people around so that they will work towards this rather. But there's perpetual forces tearing apart even the best society, the most enlightened society. Rousseau is very clear on that. Societies cannot keep this up. It's going to die. But while it's working, you get these amazing benefits. And so we can live in society as we have to in the modern world, and avoiding the worst features that he diagnosed in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, where you can get civil and moral freedom. So another thing to stress all the time for Rousseau is that Rousseau says you cannot say what is best for humans, without specifying humans at what stage of development and in what circumstances. We've just seen what might be best for a desert people. One form of government might be best for them, and a different form of government for people who live on the coast and are predominantly fishing people. So that's one sense in which what's good for humans depends on the circumstances. But also, of course, what's good for humans depends on what stage of development. This would not work for the most primitive humans, because they haven't developed their understanding. One of the things that he describes in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is humans, basically their brains expanding and then developing understanding and language and the ability to recognize the difference between one person and another person. In the very early stage, all other humans are basically the same to you. You don't even recognize your own family. So this is not going to be best for primitive humans, the hairy Neanderthals. That's not going to work for them. But for the kind of humans at the stage of evolution that we've reached, this is as good as we're going to get. And actually, it turns out that it is in some senses even better than that, because although they were free, healthy, and so on, they didn't have this self-legislation. They didn't have the power of the intellect that we have now. So, Rousseau is a very divisive figure. Some people regard him as one of the true greats of political philosophy. Others regard him as a second-level figure who's prone to, amazing statements and contradicts himself, because it's very easy to read the Discourse and the Social Contract as contradicting one another. I have come to the opinion that he is a genius. He is one of the top political thinkers. However, he is utopian. His value, I have said, is primarily as a diagnostician of what is wrong. His solution does sound impractical, but there are the germs of it, and his analysis of how liberty and equality are related, are interlinked, so that you cannot have one without the other. That is a very important insight, that inequality leads to dependence, and dependence undermines freedom. That is a genius insight that is lacking before him. But what to do with that insight, this is not going to cut it. Even he says he doesn't actually say that this will work in Geneva. He says the only place that this has a chance of working is Corsica, which is an island off the coast of France, most famous for Napoleon was sent into exile there. But it's tiny. And if that's the only place where his system can work, it would never possibly work in somewhere like the United States, then it is of very limited interest. We need something a lot more practicable that can somehow avoid the ills that he has diagnosed than what he himself suggests. And we'll see that when we get to Rawls.